you need to do these things with a runway. And that runway will be of different length for different people. For some of you, you'll need a long runway for your estate planning goals and your balance of life goals to be achieved. Others won't need a long runway. You have in place what you need to implement your plan, and that plan's going to include all those major issues that you need to think about for the balance of your life in order to fulfill your plan.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell features guests each week to discuss prominent topics for those over 55. Here's Attorney-CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome to another episode of Life's Third Act. This is actually part 2 of a segment in which we've entitled The Top 10 Mistakes People Make with Estate Planning. Now, those of you who've watched episode 1, you will know that I covered 9 items, and it turns out that we have, in fact, more than 10 that we want to call our top 10. So we've decided to make it our top 12. And the reason I want to do this is I don't want to get so caught up with the number that we had first prepared. As I thought about the list and identified things that I thought were crucial to people to know, that these are mistakes that most commonly produce major problems in your estate planning. I don't want to get so caught up with that list that I might fail to cover all the things that I think are really crucial. And it turns out that it's irresistible to include a couple more, okay? So we would call these 2 bonus mistakes. And in that, I'll start with one that was going to be number 10, and it serves, quite frankly, as a nice springboard to talk about the other 2, to sort of incorporate them into it. And it's great that we stopped at 9 because we wanted to be able to give more time and more attention to number 10, and then now we'll include these 2 additional things. So, by the way, I always forget to do this, and Justin reminds me. Please hit the subscribe button. I know you hear this every time you watch a video, but the reason you hear it is because it's so important to those of us who do this. And by people subscribing in larger numbers, we know that this is beneficial. Again, I don't make any money from doing this podcast. I do it because I enjoy it and because I believe that it's really helping you all out there. And to the extent it's not, I'd go do something else. So please let us know. And the best way to let us know is to subscribe. Also, give us any of your comments. Thank you. When we talk about this item, I think the best way to describe it is failure to adequately plan for your final years. Now, that's probably not the most delicate way to put it, but I think that it makes the point that things can go terribly wrong by failing to include a plan for what you will need during your life for the very final years. So I'm not talking about so much the last 30 years, probably, but I'm talking about a period of time when your needs escalate precipitously. So suddenly your medical care is significantly greater. Your custodial, that phrase means the people needed to take care of you in some form or other, increases. We could put these under the umbrella of saying a period of time when your capacity declines. So it doesn't have to be what we think of as utter incapacity, meaning advanced Alzheimer's, for example. It could mean simply that your capabilities are impaired or diminished to the extent that it's much more complicated and, as a result, much more expensive to care for you in those final years. I identify this as a major mistake in estate planning because this series of events, this cascade of events, ultimately flow into what exists in terms of your estate planning. And I have to say, with frustration, often changes in your estate planning that happened during these final years that with planning you could have avoided. And then the fact that that's going to have an impact for all those you care about. So it diminishes the quality of your last years. That's part of estate planning. It's not just beyond you, it's you and beyond. And that's the mentality, that's the perspective that you want your lawyer and those involved in your estate planning to have, is that this is not just about them, it's about you and them. And it's not at all self-interested, because it's not possible to think just about them without thinking about you and them. And this is illustrated by this cascade of events that I'm talking about here, and to which I would argue that people in the modern world are increasingly vulnerable. I mean, there was a time when the probability would be that there would be no substantial period of incapacity. There would be no very expensive, protracted, multi-professional circumstances in which people commonly experience later in life. There was none of that. You had a heart attack and you died, or maybe you were even diagnosed with cancer, as I'm sure many people were 100 years ago. But they stayed home. Their care was not very expensive because they didn't know what care to give them. So that's not a good thing. But I think you get the point that we wouldn't have to have this conversation in the way we're having it today many years ago. But the fact is, in the 21st century, and as we proceed through the 21st century, I'm sure this will become more emphatically true, is that this period of time in your life is something that you can't ignore, because it potentially will be the most expensive years of your life. And sadly, it's occurring at a time when you will be probably, not necessarily, probably least equipped to deal with the greatest financial challenges of your life. So the answer to this is to not just have a hope and a prayer that one of two things: you're either going to die suddenly, or you may have a period, even a long period of incapacity, but somebody else will be around who will be, your superhero, who's going to protect you and do all the things right around you. Some of us, incidentally, do have those superheroes in our family, whatnot. But, I think we agree we don't want to count on that. Furthermore, many of you have no such person. Vast majority, I guess, of people don't have such person. But this means that the conversation about estate planning has to commence at a time in your life before you've reached this period of vulnerability. And not simply before the incapacity, but it has to be sufficiently before the incapacity for you to take the steps that you need to take to position you to be able to live out those years, not simply in a financially or estate planning terms, a safe period of time, but I want to argue something more ambitious than that. I want to believe that this will be a joyous period of your life. This will be a period of time when with proper planning, yes, you may suffer this diminution in capacity. You may have some of these impairments and challenges, but you'll have it in a context where you won't have this brooding cloud that hovers over you, where things can and ultimately will go badly wrong. Instead, you feel this sense of security in the midst of this change, even though it's not necessarily happy change, granted, but you and I both know people, and we expect to be among them, who live happily, most happily even, in those last years of their life. So how do we get there? Well, we have to think about estate planning as something that is bigger and broader than what is going to be in this piece of paper that some elderly lawyer, perhaps, I'm thinking of the movie Stereotypes, where this guy has the family assembled around this conference table with anticipation soon after the funeral, and some dour lawyer is reading the terms. Estate planning goes far beyond that. Estate planning really is about you, as I said, and about them both. It's about both of your happiness. And coincidentally, to the extent that you succeed with you, you will enhance the success of them. And by them, I mean, of course, the people that you love and care for. So whenever we have this conversation, let's go back. Let's take the steps back we need to take in order to allow you to have a chance at doing your estate planning in a way that's going to maximize the quality of your life, the balance of it, as well as the lives of those you love. That means when I say sometime before incapacity, it has to be sufficiently before so that anything that you might need to do to figure out a plan, even to start implementing a plan, you can do that. And as a result, when you do your estate planning, you know that these things I will get done because I'll have the opportunity to get them done. Whether it takes a few years, it may, for some of you, you may need no lead time. You may be able to sit down and develop that plan and have it implemented, immediately, essentially. Some of you can do that. Many of us, many people will not be able to do it that way. You will need some time. You need some time to maybe locate some additional money. Some of you will continue to work in your retirement. Some of you may need to sell some assets. Some of you may need to consider about where you're living and some things that just have to be done, some pieces that have to be moved around on the chessboard, so to speak, in order for you to be positioned to have your plan, your plan, which again it includes you, but it goes beyond you, for that plan to be realized. So I wish it were true that estate planning was something where you simply go in and get it done, meaning you go into the lawyer's office, you talk about, gee, I want this to go to this person, this to go to that. I want my children to have the farm. I want my sister to be taken care of, and where you just spell out these hopes and wishes, and they're codified in this piece of paper, which ultimately is witnessed and signed, and you leave a copy with your lawyer. You put a copy in your safe deposit box, the original with your lawyer perhaps, or vice versa, and then you're done. You've taken care of it. Your estate planning is complete. I'm describing something that sounds too good to be true. I hope that you know that. Anyway, if you've been listening to this show, you know that. So when we think about estate planning in its more comprehensive terms, its more valuable and meaningful terms, then let's think about it the way we do all challenging enterprises in our lives. I mean, we all think about, magnificent things requiring some planning and some effort, some preparation, some time. And a great estate plan definitely would fit the qualifications of one of the most important endeavors, quote unquote, in our lives. So I want to take us back to this point that I've been describing before you're incompetent, and let's talk about some of the specific issues that you'll want to think about, and let's decide, is this something that will require a lot of your time? Some of you will be, as I said, will be in a better position than others to proceed and to get it done. I guess when I look at these issues, I've kind of written it down in a couple of categories, and these are not in stone, so these could be characterized differently, but I think for analytical purposes, this is a good way to think about it. So to a great extent, what you're trying to do is anticipate your incapacity. When I say incapacity, I mean that word to include, your inability to not only care for yourself and make really good decisions on your own behalf, but also to have the financial wherewithal to fund those needs. So incapacity generally is a term that's, while lawyers use it to mean strictly your cognitive capabilities, I think that we have to recognize that incapacity is a much more inclusive term that really describes the situation that people find themselves in as they age. Not everybody, maybe not even you, but I think you understand incapacity we can't simply think of as a cognitive diagnosis. Yes, we can say that things flow from that, but let's just start with the idea that you may very well face some period of time of incapacity. Don't think of this as severe. Don't think Alzheimer's. Just think some substantial diminution of your capabilities. And that's the whole point of this discussion. The reason I'm dwelling on this is because we can't assume that we have the same clarity for the rest of our hopefully long lives. Because if we did, then many of these other problems would go away, and maybe estate planning could be thinking primarily about them and not to include you. But we all know that none of us can count on that. We have to plan for what we know is a substantial risk. And that substantial risk is that you're going to have this significant period of time, maybe a decade or more, hopefully not, but maybe. And as a result, when we think about estate planning, we have to think about if we want the plan for them, your loved ones, to see fulfillment in the way you describe, we have to start by thinking about you. So now we move back to the time you're planning, and this requires the opportunity for you to do the things that you need to do in advance of hitting this valley during which you are very vulnerable, and planning in advance for your care so that you not only protect your care, but you protect their care, meaning the people that you hope to take care of. So you take care of yourself, but you also want to take care of them. And you do that by taking care of yourself. So here's the kind of categories of discussion that I've broken this out into. Let's start with medical care. Medical care may be fairly straightforward. I mean, you have Medicare, I'm pretty confident. Most people do. And, you've probably taken the steps you need to for any supplemental insurance that you might need. So the medical care is something that you've got to be able to check that box. Medical care can be a huge problem if you haven't funded it. And funding it usually means doing something more than simply the basic Medicare. So, you should have all the plans in place, A, B, C, D, whatever else that you might want to supplement. C, maybe not, but I do think that you should think about whether or not you want to do a supplemental plan or a plan that perhaps is that restricts your range of options more. So whether it's the managed care or not, still you do need to think about the importance of medical care. So I want to cover this one. I think it's probably the least complicated one, unless you have some special health concern of a medical nature that you think is not covered, then yeah, that's got to be handled. But let's just make a note of that. The medical care, for obviously reasons, you've got to have that covered in some fashion. I've not told you anything so far that you don't know. Now, the custodial care, that's a little more amorphous. And the custodial care is often what sucks up a lot of money. When you think about care that you have covered through Medicare, you have to remember that is not going to cover things that is not treatment of an illness or an injury. So we've talked about this before on the show, so I don't want to spend too much time with it, but I know new people watch the show, so I apologize to those who've heard me talk about this before. And that's that don't assume your Medicare is going to cover your custodial care, the time you need, perhaps even in a facility that looks like medical care, but in fact is just the sort of care that kind of keeps you going. And those sorts of things, even though it might be, for example, in a nursing home, nursing homes are often what's involved is not something that's going to be covered by Medicare. Now, Medicare will cover something where there's a rehab period, and I think they have up to 100 days per year. So there are some things where you can maybe be released from a hospital, go into some sort of rehab facility, often in a nursing home, skilled care when I say nursing home, and that may be covered by Medicare for 100 days. But I want you to understand the bottom line is Medicare medical care is not about the sort of care you need on an ongoing basis when you're old, when you're really old and sick, or I shouldn't use the word sick, when you're old and just, your condition's deteriorated. yeah, you may be sick, and if it's an illness that's getting treatment, your Medicare will step in and cover that. But for the most part, what's called custodial care includes care that might in fact be skilled care in a nursing home. So you have to plan for this very real possibility, because believe me, for somebody to talk to you about estate planning and talk to you about all the wonderful things you want to accomplish someday in terms of helping your family, and to not have this discussion is almost malpractice. That's a little harsh, but the point is, it's important. It's important that you understand that it's not enough to simply develop these wonderful plans based on the assumption that what you have in this world is going to, at that moment, is going to resemble at all what you're going to have in this world after you go through this period of time we're talking about. We're calling this incapacity period. It can wipe out everything that you had planned. So not only are you worse off during the balance of your life, but what may mean more to you, many of you, is that those you love, the reason you did the estate planning, that's wiped out. So the conversation we're having now is about doing your estate planning under conditions where you can fix things. You can take the steps you need to do to fix them. And one thing that needs to be fixed is your custodial care. It's not at all improbable that there will be a period of time when somebody is going to need to help you in some way. Now, it might be as limited as assisted living care. Assisted living, you pay additional from what you would get in independent living, but you get a reasonable level of care. They will assure that you take your medicine. This example, they'll assure that you take your medicine, but they won't administer your medicine. That's a little different. So there are lots of lines that are drawn between what they will do in terms of assisted living and what they'll do in quote-unquote skilled living. So maybe you'll never need to progress to the point of skilled living. That's not an unreasonable aspiration, but you don't want everything to hinge upon that hope. So if it's assisted living that you might need, then you calculate, where will that money come from? It's not going to come, remember, from your Medicare. You're probably not going to qualify for Medicaid. Now, I'm going to resist making this a Medicaid show, so I'm going to not go into various strategies, and there are some in which you might be able to qualify for Medicaid. There are ways to do that. It's not just one show, it's multiple shows, and there are some in the past where I've talked about this. It's very technical. Not a lot of estate planners fool with it because it's complicated. And there's a little bit of regulatory risk because rules change and whatnot. But it is a way for you to, you're sitting down doing this more comprehensive, inclusive estate planning that I describe, the way estate planning should be properly viewed. And if you at that time decide that I need to take the steps to assure that if I hit this custodial care period in which I'm going to be spending $15,000 a month for my nursing home care, I don't want to wipe out what money I've accumulated for my children. And I want to be sure that I have what I need for my care. So if you're going to rely on Medicaid, then that's another reason to have this conversation in advance. So I've accomplished my goal for this show and just calling your attention, the many advantages of thinking about estate planning as something that you do sufficiently in advance of incapacity to allow you to not only plan for incapacity, but to take the steps to fix it. Because most people can't fix it, do those steps in a few days. Most people need several years maybe to do that. But you probably have that if you viewed estate planning properly. And hopefully you are dealing with an estate planning attorney, for example, who has this sort of comprehensive view about achieving your goals, your estate planning goals. They have the view that they have to think not about this piece of paper that's to be read when you're shortly after you're in the ground, but instead it's a much bigger and much potentially more beneficial thing than simply that. So I'll say one more thing on Medicaid. If you do the Medicaid route, you do need potentially 60 months after you make a transfer in order to get past a look-back period. So that's an example where when you do this estate planning in sufficient advance of need, then there are some incredible things you can accomplish. You can actually you can protect your assets, believe it or not, completely. Anything that you transfer within that beyond 60 months from the transfer, if you put it, for example, in a trust, you wouldn't just transfer it to loved ones. Terrible, terrible mistake. Some people think that, well, gee, I get it out of my hands, but I won't spend the time that it would take to point out the many bad things that flow from that. The way to do it is you transfer it to a trust, and then it's a trust that's dedicated to your needs to some extent while you're alive, to some extent, but especially for the needs of your loved ones. So you kind of impoverish yourself for purposes of qualifying for Medicaid. That's one example of planning early. Another is, you may say, well, gee, I don't want to do the Medicaid route for various reasons, but I know that I'm going to need some more money in order to be sure that this plan that I'm putting in place today is realistic at all. Remember, this is the alternative to simply saying, all right, this is what I want to do with my stuff today, signing it, walking out, and assuming that nothing's going to happen substantially to alter your expectations between the time that you put the ink on that page and the time that you're lowered into your grave, to assume that nothing destructive to that plan is going to occur. I think I've persuaded you, hopefully, in what I've said already today, of the naivete of that sort of plan. So it is realistic, though, to say, I'm not going to do Medicaid, but I do want to take some steps because I think it's, maybe I'll be incapable of doing things for a while, but I do have my daughter and son. They live in town. They would be able to do lots of things. You need to think about your house, and that goes kind of to the next one, residential needs. It's really difficult to talk about these categories separately because they blur into each other and they overlap. Let me go ahead and tell you what these four categories are under what I regard as this more comprehensive perspective regarding estate planning. Medical care, custodial care, residential needs, financial needs. So you can see where these things are related, right? But they each deserve some separate discussion. But yes, of course, they're all related. Medical care, custodial care, residential needs, financial needs. So when we move, for example, from custodial care and talk about residential needs, that is very much related to the custodial needs. And in that some of you live in a place where it's very realistic to hope to stay, all the way to the point of needing skilled care, which is nursing home care. Few people have the ability to pay for that to come to their house. I mean, the economies of scale of having the equipment, the medical technology, all the professionals, the facilities, to put everybody in a single 2,500 square feet, for example, of an ICU is an extreme example, but just imagine how much more efficient it is to meet the extreme needs of someone if they're all in the same fixed area of space versus spreading those same, say, 20 people into 20 different homes around the city. So the cost of having that care to come to you is just not realistic. There are a few people that I've heard have done it because they have tons of money, but you have to acknowledge that there may be a point when you can't stay in your house. But you can also say that point could be pretty far down the road. That point for you may be very extreme. You may be able to meet your needs. If you've done a proper inventory, developed a proper plan, then you may be able to go way down the point where you're going to, a nursing home will only come to you when it's absolutely essential. And you may say, well, isn't that true for everybody? No, it's not. Many people go into nursing homes for reasons other than, quite frankly, their need. It's because where they can get care, where it can trigger some insurance coverage, where it might trigger some coverage from Medicaid, Medicaid is, now this is changing, but historically Medicaid was more available in a facility for skilled care like nursing home than it was at your home. They're changing all those policies. They're trying to encourage people to stay at home. But the point is, a lot of people go into a nursing home when they don't absolutely have to. So if you're developing a plan where you're saying, I really, really, really want to stay in my house, you need to walk it through. This is your estate planning. This is a theme that should echo in your ear throughout the show. We're doing estate planning. We're having this conversation. So let's use a situation where you have those two kids. You have two kids that live in town. Is your house one story or is it two? Where's the master bedroom? What's the width of your hallways, the width of your doorways? Do you have handles where you need them? What about your proximity to shopping, to your church? Do you have mass transit available? Do you have, your loved ones who maybe through grandchildren have sufficient time to really help grandma or grandpa, when grandma and grandpa can hardly do anything for themselves? I mean, do you have, access to that sort of support? And even if you don't have all those things, if you have enough money coming in to where you can pay for somebody to spend, 40 hours a week with you, whatever it may take, hopefully not 24/7, but 40 hours a week, maybe 20 hours a week. If you have enough money based on cash flow to where you don't invade what you would regard as the treasure chest that you want to leave your children, that plan that you have in place for your loved ones, that may be money that can be pretty well protected, and yet you still meet the needs that will get you from here to your death. And that, remember, that's the valley or this unknown territory that we're talking about here, but we're planning for. And if that's the case, if you have excess money coming in through various sources, maybe you have a pension, of course you have Social Security, you have investments perhaps. So you may be pretty confident, to the extent that I don't have loved ones locally that can chip in, then I know that I can pay for people to come and care for me at home. And let's say that all those things I mentioned about your house, they either have that characteristic or you can convert it to that. And remember, that conversion is part of the plan. You don't want to wait until you have a stroke and you're not in a position to make those calls or to manage those projects in the way that you would like. Often it's good to go ahead and do those things now. And this is another example of why we're talking about estate planning as something that needs a runway. You need sufficient time to get the things done that allows your plan to succeed. Now, some of you, though, may be thinking, well, I live in a house that I do like it. Maybe I even love my house, but I'm not so attached to it that I'm insistent on spending to the last possible hour here without having to be taken by ambulance to a skilled care facility. And I know that's a common view that many people want to stay, and I see this in my own family. But there are some great assisted living. Even you start out with independent living, then you progress or degress, whatever you want to call it, to assisted living. There are some great facilities around. Many of you know this. Many of you have looked at these. We've talked about them on the show. We've had people on who've operated these facilities, and they're just in the St. Louis area. I can speak especially, and I can speak about Naples, Florida. Just marvelous facilities. If you have the means to do that, then again, that's part of your planning is to. You don't have to move out of your house now, but you know exactly what you're going to do, where you're going to go, what it's going to cost. You've done the financial planning. If you have a heart attack next week, if something happens that suddenly you are no longer perhaps able to live where you are, you can make that move. For others of you, I would suggest that, let me just throw out the idea that it's not maybe something that you should regard as something I'll do when I have to, because I really like living in my house. I would suggest you entertain the idea at least that why wait till you have to do it? If you can see yourself potentially going there and enjoying it, it does kind of help your plan if you go ahead and implement it. And again, this whole conversation is about positioning yourself for your plan to succeed. So does it position you better for you to maybe make the move now when you're competent to oversee the many decisions involved in that? What do you keep? What do you throw away? How many rooms do you need in this new facility? How many do you want? To be able to make all those decisions that are involved in a move. Selling the house, you get to participate in decisions relating to that. It may be that rather than say, I'm going to stay here as long as I can, maybe you should instead say, maybe this place could be a much better place, and why not go when I can enjoy the sort of communal opportunities that exist in a place like that versus living, in maybe not isolation, but you certainly live with less social environment perhaps than you would have. I'm throwing it out there. That's an example of something you think about doing when you're coming along the runway and wanting to position your plan for success. It is a safer call to go ahead and get into a place that you know and trust and make a lot of tough decisions that you want to participate in. And if you wait, you may not be participating in those decisions. And you may not even be going to the same place. By that I mean the place may not be available. They may not have vacancies. Maybe somebody else is making a decision in your family that loves you that thinks maybe another place would be better. So consider that. But you see why when I think about this planning, you can see how these four categories they kind of underlies a foundation, the need for you to position yourself to see your plan in fulfillment. Incidentally, you may not see your whole plan fulfilled because you won't be there for part of it, but you can have the confidence of knowing that this plan that you've developed is realistic, and it's realistic to achieve your goals for the balance of your life as well as your children. So residential needs, I will say that some people have stronger social networks residentially, so I know that. This is not an easy decision. It's going to be very, very individual, so you would include your family in talking about that. But residential needs is probably among the most emotionally difficult in this conversation. Financial needs tie in, of course. You won't make your residential in isolation of that. But when I talk about financial needs, it is broader than simply how do I pay for custodial care, how do I pay for residential care or medical care. The financial needs, it goes to what are the funds that are available for your broader, your whole needs, the balance of your life. So do you want to travel? Do you want to, what type of car do you want to drive? Things that you might think of as more financial planning for your day-to-day life today than thinking about these as a component of the fulfillment of your ultimate plan, which is the balance of your life and the welfare of the people you care for beyond. So when you think about, though, those financial needs, it is going to drive to some extent your decisions about a period of incapacity. Again, don't think of incapacity as being in a vegetative state, because then you may think some of these things are not relevant. Incapacity just means diminished capabilities. You may still travel. You may still be able to do lots of things you'd otherwise want to do. How much money will be necessary to fund, this vision that you have for the balance of your life? So it will include a period of time before you become incompetent. And in fact, again, it's possible you'll never be incompetent. And that means that you're still in good shape. But at least you have planned for something that if it happens, it doesn't blow a massive hole in your estate plan as well as to include the balance of your life. So financial needs is something that you've got to sit down and incorporate. Are you going to end up having to soak up the resources that you intended to convey through your estate planning? You've probably thought about this even in the absence of this more holistic, comprehensive estate planning that I've been describing today. You've probably already thought about, I hope you've thought about, how much of your plan is going to be left to be distributed when you're gone. And that is going to directly result from the amount that you will have to consume. not just with respect to health care, not just with respect to custodial care or residential care, but also with respect to your quality of life. I mean, what do you want to do? Where are you going to go? Is the plan that where you are going to create college funds for each of your grandchildren, is that realistic with what you think you'll likely consume for the balance of your life? And you may decide, well, it may not be too realistic. It may be improbable, but it doesn't really matter because, I figure I'm going to live and use whatever I want. Whatever's left, they can have. So I'm not being judgmental. That is some people's priorities, is I'm going to use what I can for my care and my desires and wishes, and whatever's left, I want to go to these people that I love. I would suggest that I would have a different set of priorities, quite frankly, but I don't want to stand in judgment of your priorities. And if that is that, then it means that really estate planning is residual planning. It means whatever residue there might be, this is where I want it to go. And I would suggest then that the amount of thought and money that you would pour into creating a marvelous plan that would be multi-generational, dynasty planning, for example. And remember, that doesn't mean that you're rich, but it means that you create this marvelous plan for your children, your grandchildren, and beyond that just flows from generation to the next. And it's this marvelous vehicle that I've talked about so much on this show and continue to talk about, is that you can provide such massive protection to the people you care for and give them such advantages in the accumulation of wealth that occurs over time. You know the math in terms of rates of return and compounding and whatnot. So for somebody who has a residual view of estate planning, then it probably doesn't make sense to have a lawyer pour a lot of thought into that because it does cost a little more money to pour the attention needed to assure that something so marvelous as I've just described to you is actually going to be functional and will deliver those marvelous benefits. But if your view is not that, then this sort of comprehensive estate planning I describe is going to be heavily front-end focused, and whatever's left on the back end is just going to be a residue. And so you want to spend most of your money not just spending it in terms of the corpus or the pot of money, we'll call it, but also in terms of your time and attention. So the planning expense itself should be focused more on the balance of your life rather than the planning that I just described. You have to decide that, and don't let your lawyers impose on you a set of priorities that may not be yours. Many of the clients that I've had, their primary goal was to assure that their families got the maximum benefit from the accumulation of their life, whatever that is, whether rich or poor. It's 100% of what they've accumulated, but subject to their being able to meet their needs. I'm not suggesting that planning where you're thinking primarily about beyond you that's in disregard of you. The clients that I'm describing generally, they care about their quality of life. They care about paying for their medical expenses and whatnot, but they care about it in the context of a plan that is broader than them and more important than them, quite frankly. So it's not an either or. It's about where emphasis lies and where compromises might have to be made of some sort. It may be not severe at all. Some people don't have to make any compromises because there's enough there to meet their needs for the balance of their life, and including their lifestyle and their travel and their residence and residential care, and still leave plenty for those beyond. So you have to think about that, because the answer to that question is going to dictate where you go with your attorney. And there are people who may not have much of a family left, and their entire plan is really focused on maximizing their care and their quality of life and their lifetime goals, and with little or no attention to thereafter. That is a sort of estate planning, and it's just an estate planning that is very focused on your care during your lifetime. But it could still be a care during which you're incompetent. And quite frankly, if there were a period of incompetency, then it's going to be in the probate court. So it's interesting that probate, the probate court hears the care of people for the balance of their lives when they're incompetent, and they also, of course, deal with their stuff when they're gone. So that's what probate courts do. And I'll just kind of wrap up this discussion by saying that when among the things that you want to do when you think about this comprehensive view that I've just described is you want to think about, do you have the documents in place? And remember, that's not just the will, it's not just a trust, but you also have to have a durable power of attorney for health care. We've talked about this. We've talked about it as other items as part of the estate planning, but I just come back to this as an example of you need to do these things with a runway. And that runway will be of different length for different people. For some of you, you'll need a long runway for your estate planning goals and your balance of life goals to be achieved. Others won't need a long runway. You have in place what you need to implement your plan, and that plan's going to include all those major issues that you need to think about for the balance of your life in order to fulfill your plan. So this is kind of the introduction to number 10. I would say I'll add a couple other items here real quickly as we close so that I don't dip into a third show. One of the things that I would add as a factor to consider in estate planning is overlooking the liquidity requirements at death. That sounds real stuffy and boring, but all it means is that depending on what your assets are, is it farm, is it a business, what is it? There are what are called liquidity needs, meaning that the tax guy, if there are taxes owed, if you have a substantial estate and there are taxes owed from the state gift tax, they're going to have 9 months from the date of death to come up with the money. Now, there are some statutes that are protective that might provide some relief, but not always. So that's an example of a massive expense that can be due. Another could be if you've not planned, if there's a business in which there are other shareholders or partners, and so one dies, you immediately want to acquire that interest in order for the business to continue functioning and not be distributed among strangers. So that often requires a buy-sell agreement. Perhaps there's insurance involved, but whatever the solution is, there has to be something in place. This is what I mean when I talk about liquidity. Liquidity simply means that there has to be enough cash to pay for whatever expenses there may be associated with your estate. Sometimes that liquidity may refer to how you want to distribute the assets. Maybe there's a single business that has a lot of value. So what do you give the other child if there are 2 children? Well, liquidity can fix that if there's money to transfer over. And this kind of spills over into another point that I would make, and that's coordinating assets with the beneficiaries. So all this means is think about not I want to distribute my estate in terms of percentages, but think about the fact that some assets are more compatible with some children than others. And I talked a little bit about this with one of the previous points on this list. But the whole idea is that I don't want you to feel like you have to give each of the same assets in shares to the same children. So when I talked about before the fact that you can use percentages, I'd simply mean that there are alternatives, and you can simply decide that I want to allocate my assets in a specific way to specific people for specific purposes. And some of those assets require care and skill. They require an interest on the part of the person. So these are all things that should affect your distribution plan. But liquidity serves those goals as well as the goals of anyone else who's knocking at the door, demanding that you pay an expense, that you pay a creditor, that you distribute money. There's just various things other than the tax man, whether it's state or federal, that might require funds when you're gone. So think about in your estate planning, what is it that might need to be sold or will be available in advance, and then put that in your provisions. And your trustee, incidentally, if you have a trust, which we strongly advocate, will have some discretion as to how to handle that. But it's very easy to just think, I put a plan in place that's fair to everybody, and I've done my part. Well, you've not really done your part if you've not thought about how is it that this will be implemented when you're gone. Some things are clunky and they can't be sold. Or if they're sold, they're going to be sold at a huge discount. And that impairs the benefit to everybody. So think about a distribution plan that really makes sense given the personalities involved in conjunction with the particular assets involved. So this kind of wraps up 12 items. Is that where we ended up, Justin?
Right on the money.
So I added a couple other items, but I really hope the discussion of item number 10 gives you a whole different perspective as to how you approach your estate planning. It's the right way to do it, and be sure that your lawyer agrees with that. Anyway, this has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Hope this was helpful. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement, sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.